I was paralyzed when I saw my wife kissing her boss at the company couple's dinner, so I went over to them and said, "Congratulations to the new couple," and looked at her and said, "I hope you are happy with your new choice, and with the consequence of being away from me and my children." When she heard that, she froze, her lips still parted, frozen between surprise and fear. But I wasn't announcing the gift. I was just talking about what would come next. And, without her being able to react, I turned my back, took a deep breath and left that stuffy room with the golden lights and the curious looks behind. I walked back to my life. Or to what was left of it. That night, my world turned to dust, but at the same time, a new man was born inside me. A man who no longer accepted being an accomplice to his own pain. There was no scandal, no screams, no public tears. There was silence. A silence as sharp as glass. A silence that told me more than any flimsy explanation could. I was once told that cheating is a mistake. But no. A mistake is made on impulse, without knowing. Cheating is a choice. Cold. Calculated. Done in secret, with strategic pauses for kisses between laughs at social dinners. Done when someone looks into your eyes, says, "I love you," and hours later undresses completely in front of another, carrying the scent of your pillow on their body. And that's exactly what happened to me. To her. To our story. For years, I was the present partner, the devoted father, the man who learned to cook on Sundays just to see my children smiling at the table, and she pretended to admire it. She pretended so well that even I believed it. Until fate brutally and publicly confronted me with the truth. And what hurt the most was not the kiss, the touch, the look between the two of us. It was her coldness when she saw me approaching. She didn't let go of his hand, she didn't look away, she didn't move away. She just froze, as if she had been caught making a small mistake. It wasn't. It was the end. And I declared it right there. The only sentence I could muster with the dignity I had left was the sentence that changed everything: "I hope you are happy with your new choice, and with the consequence of being away from me and my children." And with that, everything changed. That sentence echoed through the room like a muffled thunder. Her boss let go of her hand. He tried to come up with some excuse, but it was too late. The audience had seen it. Her colleagues, her friends from the company, everyone. Some looked away, others pretended to drink another glass of wine. But no one intervened. I hadn't expected it. I didn't care anymore. What hurt now was the image of my children sleeping at home, innocent, unaware that, at that very moment, the concept of family they knew was being destroyed. I got home late that night. The kids were already asleep. I went into each of their rooms, sat on the edge of the bed, and breathed in the scent of the childhood I had always protected. I promised myself that nothing and no one would destroy that. The next day, I started the divorce process. Quick, clean, straightforward. I called a lawyer who was known more for his coldness than his kindness. I needed someone like that. I had to repeat every detail coldly, even as the words choked in my throat. "She cheated on me with her boss," I said. At the company dinner. He took notes, asked me about the kids, about custody, about the assets. I didn't want to fight over anything other than my kids. She could have the rest. All I wanted was distance. From that touch that had once warmed me and now made me sick. She tried to reach out to me. At first, just short messages. "Can we talk? Are you okay?" It was a mistake. The messages evolved into phone calls, unexpected visits, tears in her eyes. But what she didn't understand was that the love she killed didn't die all at once. It rotted slowly, with every lie told, every deceitful gesture, every lame excuse. When she touched me for the last time before all this happened, she was already sharing that touch with someone else. When she smiled at me, it was because she was comparing my presence to his absence. When she said she loved me, she was betraying herself more than me. And now, nothing made sense anymore. The children began to notice. The silence between their parents. The distance. Her room, untouched but empty. The supervised visits. The downcast glances. And then came the question that destroyed me, Daddy, why doesn't Mommy have dinner with us anymore? How do you explain to a child that love also dies? That promises made out loud are sometimes broken in the whispers of a hotel room? That there are mistakes that cannot be erased with apologies, flowers, or memories? She tried to convince me that she regretted it. She cried. She said she was confused. That the kiss didn't mean anything. That it was an impulse. That her boss was needy. That she felt invisible. That it was all just a reflection of her busy life, her tired marriage, her exhausting routine. But she never admitted the essential, that she had made the choice. That she had accepted the invitation. That she had gotten ready knowing what she would do. That she had crossed the line knowing there was a home waiting for her, and yet she had gone anyway. She never admitted it. And that was when I knew, it wasn't regret. It was fear of losing her comfort. Fear of losing her children. Fear of facing alone the world she had helped destroy. But I moved on. Not out of revenge. But because I refused to teach my children that loving someone means submitting to humiliation. That forgiving means accepting crumbs. That trust is something that can be rebuilt without the other person even acknowledging the destruction. No. I moved on because I respected myself. Because I looked in the mirror and, for the first time in a long time, felt proud of myself. Because I understood that pain is temporary, but the loss of one's dignity can be eternal. And then, in the midst of the chaos, in the midst of the reconstruction, something unexpected happened. A meeting. Someone who listened to my story without judging me. Who saw beyond my pain. Who didn't try to take anyone's place, but simply offered me a new space to breathe. And in that space, little by little, I rediscovered life. Love. Trust. My children smiled again. Laughter filled the hallways of the house again. And the silence between the rooms was replaced by conversations, by music, by true affection. Meanwhile, she watched from afar. She tried to get closer. She tried to win him back. But time doesn't come back. Love, once broken, can't be rebuilt in a hurry. And maybe not even with time. She cried. She said she had changed. That she understood everything. That it was an irreparable mistake. But the truth is that, even though she regretted it, it was too late. Because I had finally learned to live without her. And this is where it all really begins. Because the pain of betrayal is not the end. It is just the gateway. What comes next, what really changes someone's life, is the way they choose to live after seeing their own soul being crushed by the person they claimed to love. And what happened to her, when she realized that the husband who once begged for her attention was now smiling next to another woman, is something that neither she, nor her boss, nor anyone else there expected. Because the true punishment for betrayal does not come from revenge. It comes from forgetting. But what happened next, what she did when she realized she had lost what was irreplaceable, is what makes this story unmissable. Because no one imagined she would be able to come this far for a second chance. And no one expected what he would say when she got down on her knees and begged him to come back. Because in that moment, what he revealed, changed everything. And that's why this story needs to be heard to the end. Because what was said after that, no one expected. Not even her. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support any kind of betrayal, under no circumstances. The stories you will hear are fictional, but inspired by reality. And they have a single purpose, to show how betrayal destroys lives, families and hearts. Get ready, because what's coming next is strong, realistic and absolutely shocking. Good story. During the first 15 years of their marriage, Daniel and Laura were considered by everyone around them to be an exemplary couple. They were the kind of couple that seemed to work with an almost enviable harmony, the kind that dances at the wedding party with a knowing look and, 10 years later, still looks at each other with the same tenderness in the supermarket queue. They met when they were young, he was 25, she was 23, both coming out of relationships that left deeper scars than they dared admit at the time. Laura was methodical, detail-oriented, organized to the point of writing down Daniel's friends' birthdays in a physical diary, even though there were already reminders on his cell phone. Daniel was more practical, emotionally centered, the kind of person who listens in silence but absorbs everything and always knows when the other person needs a hug instead of advice. They got married in a simple ceremony, surrounded by emotional family, smiling friends and silent promises that everything would last forever. They began their life together in a modest house, the kind that smells of fresh paint, used furniture with new stories and a freshly brewed coffee that always tasted better on Sunday mornings. Their conversations ranged from the lightheartedness of a new recipe for dinner to reflections on children, careers, and dreams yet to be realized. Little by little, they built a life based on mutual respect and an intimacy that developed in the little things, in the silence shared after a difficult day, in the notes left on the kitchen table, in the glances exchanged when their children said something unexpected. Laura has always been ambitious in the practical sense of the word. She wanted to grow professionally, yes, but she also wanted stability, comfort and a sense that her life was following a coherent path, even if it required sacrifices. So, while Daniel preferred a more relaxed pace of life, she threw herself energetically into the projects of the company she worked for. She became a team manager at 33 and, over time, one of the most respected figures in the sector. She would arrive late some nights, take spreadsheets to review on the weekend, but she made up for it with family trips, lovingly planned dinners and carefully chosen gifts on birthdays. She said that love lived in the details, and Daniel believed that with all his heart. With the birth of Lucas, their firstborn, and 2 years later, Marina, their youngest, their lives took on a new color. Daniel, who was already emotionally invested in the relationship, threw himself into fatherhood. He reduced his workload at the architecture firm where he worked to be more closely involved in his children's childhood. He was the one who took them to and from school, who attended children's theater performances, who decorated the house for Christmas with an exaggeration that made Laura laugh. And she, even though she was overwhelmed with spreadsheets and meetings, was always present when it mattered. If work demanded dedication, her children demanded love, and she tried to balance both as best she could. Family weekends had their own rituals. Saturday mornings were pancake time, with the little ones helping to turn the batter and spilling flour all over the floor. In the afternoons, they would visit a nearby park, where the children would run free and the two would exchange knowing looks, as if, no matter how tired they were, they knew that this was what really mattered. At night, when the children were asleep, they would share a glass of wine and catch up on their TV shows, even though Laura, exhausted, always fell asleep before the end of the episode. Daniel would cover her with the duvet and turn off the TV with the remote in his other hand, smiling. Their relationship, although solid, was not perfect. There were disagreements, of course. Laura sometimes demanded more initiative from Daniel regarding her own dreams. She thought he had become complacent in his role as father and husband, forgetting a little about himself. He, in turn, felt that Laura was increasingly absorbed in her professional world and less present in the little things that she herself once valued. But there were never any serious fights, heated arguments or unspoken hurts. On the contrary, they talked, expressed their frustrations, cried together if necessary. And, most of the time, they ended up hugging in the same bed where they had promised, years before, never to sleep apart out of pride. Things began to change subtly. It wasn't all at once. First, there were silences that lasted longer than usual. Then, family dinners became quicker and less full of conversation. Laura began traveling more frequently for work, and Daniel, without complaining, organized the children's routines on his own, sending photos of the drawings they made to his mother, videos of the school presentations that she couldn't watch. Her voice on the phone was still sweet, but distant. As if you were somewhere else all the time. He noticed, but preferred not to interpret it. Even so, Daniel never stopped showing love. He took care of the house, the school, the meals. On their wedding anniversary, he prepared a dinner with her favorite recipes and left a note with sincere words under the plate. She smiled, thanked him, and told him she loved him. And at that moment, he believed her. Because love, in his view, survived even when the routine seemed heavy. Love was resistance. And it resisted. At work, Laura was on a silent rise. She was admired, respected, and constantly praised in meetings. Her confident demeanor and quick thinking made her an indispensable professional. She began to get more involved in company events, get-togethers, and strategic meetings. She always made a clear statement: "It's important for my growth." Daniel supported her. He was proud of her. Sometimes he would wait for her to come back late, making tea and asking how the event went. And she would almost always say she was tired but satisfied. She never went into too much detail, never gave too many names. He didn't insist. He trusted her. The children continued to be the center of the household. Lucas, now 8 years old, began to ask more complex questions. He wanted to know how the world worked, why people lied, why there were wars. Marina, more sensitive, drew scenes of the family with colorful houses and people holding hands. Daniel kept the drawings in a special folder. And Laura, even with her time growing shorter, praised him, kissed him, and made sure to be present as little as possible. But something inside her had changed. And he began to feel it. The smell of her perfume seemed new. The way she dressed to go out became more refined. She smiled less at home, talked more on her cell phone than to him, and when she was around, her gaze seemed distant, as if she was always trying to remember something, or someone. Daniel began to lose sleep. He spent the night trying to find answers that she never gave him. He asked if everything was okay. She said yes. Always with the same intonation. Always with the same eyes that no longer held his. Still, he believed it was just a phase. That the fatigue, the work, the pressure, were taking too much out of her. He never suspected anything else. He never allowed himself to think that something outside of their marriage was interfering with what they had. Because, to him, what they had was real. It was strong. It was true. And it was with this in mind that he prepared for the company's couples' dinner. An elegant event, attended by all of Laura's co-workers, strategic partners, and directors. She insisted that he go. She said she wanted to introduce him to some people. Daniel hesitated. He didn't really like that kind of event, but he accepted. He chose a dark suit, fixed his tie with the help of his son, kissed his daughter on the forehead, and left with Laura, believing that perhaps, that night, he could bring them closer together. That night, he still loved. That night, he still believed. That night, he was still the man who made a promise before everyone, in sickness and in health, in joy and in sorrow, until death do us part. But that night, something started to die. And he didn't know it yet. The room was lit by warm, elegant amber tones, the kind of light that seemed carefully planned to make everything seem more beautiful than it was. There were fine glasses on each table, discreet arrangements of white and green flowers, waiters with balanced trays circulating among smiling executives and impeccably dressed wives. Daniel arrived at the event with a faint anxiety in his chest, but it was disguised behind a polite smile and a sincere effort to fit in, even though this was not his environment. He was next to Laura, and as comfortable as she seemed in that space, something in her posture betrayed a divided attention, a gaze that was not completely fixed on any one place. He noticed this, but refused to interpret it. He walked with her through the room, shook hands, heard compliments about her work, about her competence, about how much she was admired. And Daniel, as always, felt proud. Genuine pride. Laura stepped aside a few times to greet colleagues he didn't know. She said she'd be back soon, that it was just a quick chat. Daniel stayed at the table, drinking slowly, observing the environment. In front of him, couples were talking lightly, some laughing loudly, others exchanging glances that seemed charged with true intimacy. And he found himself thinking about how appearances could be deceiving, how easy it was to imagine that all those people were truly happy. He felt out of place, not because of the environment, but because of an internal sensation that was beginning to grow silently, like a thin mist that took over his chest without warning. Laura returned a few minutes later with a man by her side. Tall, confident, with a smile that seemed practiced, the kind that precedes rehearsed words. She introduced him as the director of the department, someone she worked with directly on several projects. Daniel politely extended his hand, heard an empty compliment about how it must be hard to have such a sought-after wife, and laughed out of obligation. The conversation continued with pleasantries, observations about the market, and a few corporate jokes that didn't make much sense to outsiders. The man was polite, but there was a confidence about him that was uncomfortable. He spoke to Laura too intimately. The touches on her arm, the long smiles, the way he leaned in to say something that only she could hear. Daniel noticed, but, once again, ignored it. Until then, he still wanted to believe it. When dinner was served, Laura sat next to him and kept her cell phone in her hand for most of the meal. She texted him with a frequency he was already familiar with, but that night seemed more intense. Daniel tried to make conversation, comment on the food, the decoration, the children. She responded, but without really being there. Her eyes always returned to the phone screen, and her smile appeared at times that didn't match what was being said at the table. That began to eat away at Daniel from the inside, slowly and steadily, like an invisible leak that only reveals itself when the ceiling is about to collapse. After dinner, the guests began to circulate more freely, chatting in smaller groups, exchanging cards, discussing business. Laura said she needed to resolve something quickly with the marketing team and left. Daniel stayed at the table for a while longer, but something inside him was pulsing strongly. A restlessness that was not just jealousy, but an intuition that finally refused to be ignored. He stood up and began to walk around the room, discreetly, without knowing exactly what he was looking for, guided only by a growing uneasiness that accelerated his heart. Turning down one of the corridors at the back of the main hall, where there was less movement, Daniel heard muffled voices and hurried footsteps. He followed instinctively. A little ahead, near a glass wall that overlooked the hotel gardens, he saw Laura. She was there, with the director of the sector. Alone. And what he saw was enough to paralyze his muscles. He was holding her by the waist, their faces were too close, and when they kissed, it was not an impulsive or quick gesture. It was an intimate kiss, lingering, full of familiarity. A kiss that is only possible between two bodies that have recognized each other before. Time seemed to stop. Daniel felt a heat invade his face, a pressure in his chest as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. He didn't think, he didn't hesitate, he just walked towards them with firm steps. When he got closer, the kiss broke with the expression of terror that took over Laura's face when she saw him. She took a step back, the director maintained his posture, perhaps believing that maintaining arrogance was a way to escape the embarrassment. Daniel stared at them for a few seconds, took a deep breath, and said with cutting calm, "Congratulations to the new couple." And then he looked directly into her eyes, without raising his tone, without shedding a tear, he simply said, "I hope you're happy with your new choice. And with the consequence of being away from me and my children." Laura stood still. Not a word. Her silence said it all. The director stepped back discreetly, and Daniel, without waiting for a response, turned and walked back into the hall, toward the exit, toward the reality that had just changed before his eyes. The noise of conversations became background noise again, laughter echoed like muffled mockery, and the air, previously filled with expensive perfumes, now seemed toxic. Outside, the cold night wind hit his face like a slap, and it was only there, under the lights of the parking lot, that he allowed himself to shiver. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just felt his heart shrink, as if something had been ripped out of it without anesthesia. He drove home in silence. The car seemed to float through the streets, as if the headlights weren't illuminating any path. When he arrived, he got in slowly, without turning on the lights, and went straight to his children's room. He kissed each of their foreheads. He promised, without words, that he would protect them from everything, including that pain. And then he sat on the sofa in the living room, in silence, trying to understand at what point his story had split in half. The next day, Laura arrived in the morning. She hadn't been drinking, but her eyes were red. She didn't try to justify herself. She just said she needed to talk. Daniel didn't answer. He stood up and handed her a folder with papers already organized, beginning of the separation process, custody of the children, division of assets. She tried to say something, but he interrupted. He said there was no room for speeches. That what they had seen was enough. And that, from that moment on, she was free. Free to live whatever she wanted, but without him. And most importantly, away from the children. Over the next few days, she tried to resume the dialogue. She sent messages, showed up at unexpected moments, cried at the door, asked to see the children. Daniel remained calm. He followed the law. He authorized supervised visits, but kept his distance. He didn't want war. He wanted distance. Because the war had already been fought inside him, on the night of the dinner, when he saw everything he believed to be true crumble before his eyes. But there was something Laura hadn't said yet. A detail, a part of the story that still remained buried. Something that would explain much of what was to come. A secret that, when revealed, would completely change the course of what they thought they knew about that betrayal. And that secret was about to come to light. Laura spent days trying to rebuild what was no longer there. Messages that were once spaced out became insistent. Visits turned into pleas. The woman who had once been confident, meticulous, determined, now knocked on the door with sunken eyes and a trembling voice, begging not for forgiveness, but for time that no longer belonged to her. Daniel, for his part, remained firm. There was no longer anger in his gestures, nor bitterness in his words, only the solidity of someone who had understood that love, when betrayed, does not die all at once, but melts away silently, like snow melting in the sun. The children were beginning to notice, even if they did not fully understand. Lucas avoided talking about his mother. Marina asked about her with a curiosity that hurt, and Daniel always answered carefully, without lying, but also without accusing. The house continued its course with the precision of a new forced routine. He had decided to move on, and he was determined to rebuild a life without the rubble of what had been destroyed. But Laura wouldn't accept it. There was something in her eyes that seemed more than guilt. It wasn't just remorse for having crossed a line that couldn't be reversed. It was something else. A deep, almost existential despair. As if she had realized too late that what she had lost was all that was most real to her. And it was on a Wednesday afternoon, under a light rain that scratched the balcony windows, that Daniel, upon opening the door once more with the intention of saying that there was nothing more to talk about, came across something different. Laura wasn't dressed as before. There was no makeup on her face, no attempt to appear in control. Her eyes were red, and in her hands trembled a thin folder with some crumpled papers. She asked to come in. He said it wasn't about reconciliation, nor about asking for anything else. It was about the truth. The last one. And that's what he needed to hear. Daniel hesitated, but allowed it. Not out of curiosity, but because something in her voice seemed to cry out for an end. A real end. She sat on the couch where, years before, they had shared laughter, movies, and conversations about the future. Now the space between them felt like an abyss. She didn't speak right away. She took several deep breaths, stared at the floor, and clasped her fingers on her knees. Daniel watched in silence. He wasn't about to fall into any more emotional traps. But then, finally, she began to speak. She said there was a reason for everything, not an excuse, but an origin. That there was something he didn't know. Something that was changing the way she had been behaving for the past 2 years. Daniel crossed his arms, still skeptical. But she continued. She said that her involvement with her boss had not started out of attraction, nor out of emotional need. There was no passion there, not even the desire that often motivates common betrayals. What she was looking for was anesthesia. A numbing agent for what she was feeling inside. And then she handed him the folder. Daniel opened it slowly. Inside were medical reports, prescriptions. Laura had been undergoing psychiatric treatment for over a year and a half. Dependent personality disorder, panic attacks, severe anxiety. But that wasn't what hurt the most about the content of those pages. What was most heartbreaking was the line highlighted in red in one of the reports: patient presents feelings of paralyzing guilt resulting from a family secret kept silent for over 8 years. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. She looked into his eyes and said that she needed to tell him everything now. Because she could no longer bear to carry this alone. The room became even quieter. Laura began to tell her story, her voice low and her words weighing tons. She said that her relationship with her boss began shortly after a conversation she had with someone he had never imagined, his own sister. Daniel's eyes widened, but he didn't interrupt. Laura continued. She said that years ago, when they were having financial difficulties, she sought help without his knowledge. She asked for an informal loan, in desperation, to cover a credit card debt that was in his name and that she had hidden. His sister offered the money. But on one condition, that Laura never revealed to Daniel that he was being betrayed, not only financially, but emotionally, by his own family. Daniel didn't understand. Laura then said that his sister had had an affair with the ex-husband of one of his best childhood friends, and that this betrayal had destroyed 2 families. When Laura found out about this, she threatened to tell. To silence her, her sister offered her the money and demanded that she never tell anyone about what she knew, neither about the debt nor the betrayal. Afraid, guilty and feeling trapped by something that wasn't hers, Laura accepted. But from that day on, something began to eat away at her conscience. From then on, she began to feel manipulated, powerless, suffocated. She began to question her own marriage, the truth surrounding it, and what was right or wrong. And in that imbalance, she allowed herself to slip down paths that she would never have taken in her right mind. Daniel listened to everything with his eyes fixed on her, but without expression. Inside, his world was shaking again. His betrayal, Laura's betrayal with the boss, was already a deep wound. But what she was revealing now was another layer. A silence hidden for years, involving his family, his history, his trust in people. The sister he defended, with whom he grew up, with whom he shared childhood secrets, had used his wife as a shield to hide her own dirt. And Laura, by accepting it, had become an accomplice. She ended by saying that she knew none of this justified what she did, but that she needed to cleanse herself of it. That her guilt didn't just come from the kiss, or the involvement. It came from the prolonged silence, the lie hidden in small everyday actions, the look she hadn't been able to hold for years. And that, when she started the affair with her boss, she was so immersed in self-sabotage that she no longer knew what she was trying to punish, herself, her marriage, or that secret that was never hers. Daniel stood up. He walked around the room in silence, breathing heavily. His thoughts were jumbled with memories, with fragments of past conversations, with gestures that now took on new meanings. The marital betrayal was already an abyss. But the emotional betrayal that came from his own family was another pain, deeper, older, more ingrained. He felt betrayed twice. Once by the woman he shared his life with. Another by the sister he considered part of what was unshakable. Laura said there was more. That his sister not only knew about the affair with the boss, but had subtly encouraged it. She said he was a very good man, but lacking in ambition. That perhaps Laura deserved more. That she deserved to feel alive. That she shouldn't hold herself back out of guilt. Daniel heard this and felt the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. His sister's absences, the veiled advice, the observations disguised as care. Everything took on darker tones. Everything hurt in a new way. He turned to Laura and, for the first time, spoke. He said that he understood now. He didn't forgive, but he understood. And that, as strange as it might seem, he felt sorry for her. For the pain she had carried in silence. For the life she had allowed herself to lose out of fear, submission, shame. He said that she needed help, but that help would no longer come from him. That their time was over. That all that was left now was to heal, each in their own way. Laura nodded through her tears. She said she didn't expect anything more from him. She just wanted to free him from doubt. And that, somehow, she could free herself too. And that's how Daniel learned that behind the visible betrayal, there was a labyrinth of silences, broken pacts, and wrong choices. And that, as painful as it was, he finally understood that this wasn't just about infidelity. It was about truths that were kept too tightly. About secrets that, when they come to light, don't just destroy relationships. They dismantle identities. And at that moment, something inside him ended. But something else was beginning to be born. Something unexpected. Something that would transform everything. Because life, even after so many falls, still had surprises in store. And one of them was already on its way. Daniel spent that night unable to close his eyes. The house, silent as ever, seemed to amplify every thought, every remnant of dialogue that echoed in his mind as if he were still sitting in front of it. He walked from one room to another like a man in a trance, trying to reorganize the fragments of his own story. The truth that Laura had told had exposed not only the marital betrayal, but a much deeper and more silent wound, the rupture of trust in everything that seemed solid to him. He tried in vain to find a straight line in the middle of that tangle of lies that now crossed his life. In the morning, when the first rays of sunlight crossed the curtains, Daniel sat at the kitchen table and stared at his cup of coffee as if it could offer answers. But all there was the bitter taste of reality. He decided he needed to talk to his sister. It was inevitable. The pain of knowing that someone from within, someone he had shared his childhood with, had become an accomplice in a cycle of destruction, was eroding his peace. He didn't want confrontation, but he needed clarity. He called her and asked her to come to his house. He didn't explain why, he didn't use harsh words. He just said it was important. When she arrived, smiling as if she hadn't expected what was coming, she found a different brother. Daniel's gaze was firm, but distant. He invited her in, offered her a glass of water, and got straight to the point. He said he knew everything. About the money, the secret, the influence on Laura's choices. The woman in front of him turned pale. She tried to deny it, to equivocate, to cover up the facts. But Daniel was firm. He repeated the details, mentioned the exact words Laura had said, the papers, the conversations. There was no more room for lies. The sister, after a few minutes of silence, finally broke down. She said she had done everything on impulse, that she didn't want to see her brother unhappy, that she had always thought Laura was superior to him in many ways and that, deep down, she believed that the marriage was already dying. That her intention was not to destroy it, but to provoke a wake-up call in Laura. Daniel just listened, his jaw clenched, his fingers intertwined. When she finished, he took a deep breath and said that forgiveness was a process, but that the separation would be immediate. There would be no more room for her in the lives of their children, in family celebrations, or on dates that had once been shared with affection. And that, if time brought understanding one day, he would be open to looking at her again. But now, all that was left was silence. The sister cried. She tried to touch him. He pulled away. And when she left, he felt the weight of the world lighten a little, as if at least part of the emotional debris was being removed. In the days that followed, Daniel avoided any contact with Laura. He limited his conversations to the essentials, related only to the children. He kept to his routine with precision, focused on his architectural projects, and little by little he allowed himself to breathe again. He started running every morning. His body needed to move as much as his mind needed to be quiet. On cold mornings, he listened to music, felt the wind on his face, and let the pain come out in the form of sweat. Little by little, something inside him began to reorganize itself. It wasn't exactly happiness, but there was a new tranquility. A silence that no longer hurt, that now seemed necessary. The freedom of no longer carrying guilt that wasn't his. It was on a Saturday afternoon that he met someone he hadn't seen for a long time. Sophia, the mother of one of Marina's classmates, with whom he exchanged quick glances at children's parties and brief conversations in the school hallways. Divorced for 3 years, she had 2 children and a shy but sincere smile. The two crossed paths at the park where they usually took their children, and instead of just a polite wave, they ended up sitting on the same bench to watch their children play. The conversation began with trivialities, evolved into light confidences and, before they knew it, they were laughing with the same lightness that seemed lost long ago. Sophia didn't ask invasive questions, she didn't want to understand the past. She just listened. Daniel felt something strange, the desire to be there, at that moment, and not somewhere else. And that, for him, was already a start. During their next meetings, they began to see each other outside the park. First, they had a casual coffee, then they had lunch with the children. Marina quickly became attached to Sophia, and Lucas, always more observant, began to smile when he saw them talking. Daniel took his time. He wasn't looking for a replacement, nor did he want to fill emotional gaps. What he found in Sophia was true companionship, without rushing, without pressure. And that was enough. 2 months after his last emotional contact with Laura, he found himself smiling more, sleeping better and, above all, feeling proud of what he had rebuilt. Not a life like the one before, but a new one, with its own roots and sincere promises. But Laura, even from a distance, kept watching. She knew about the visits, the meetings, the laughter. She tried to maintain her composure, but her eyes said otherwise. She was destroyed. And what corroded her the most was the realization that, despite everything, Daniel had moved on. Not with resentment, not with ostentation. He had moved on in peace. And that was what hurt the most. Because while she was trying to rebuild herself amidst the guilt, he was flourishing. One night, after an event at school, Laura approached Daniel in the parking lot. There was no one around. The children were with Sophia, already in the car. She approached slowly, and with tears in her eyes, she said she needed to talk. Daniel looked over his shoulder, made sure the children were not around, and nodded. Laura said she didn't sleep well, that she had panic attacks all the time, and that she tried every day to find a reason to carry on. She said she knew he wouldn't come back, that he shouldn't, but that she still loved him. That seeing him move on with someone else made something inside her bleed. Daniel remained silent. Then she came closer and said she just wanted to understand. How he had managed to rebuild himself after everything. How it was possible to love again after being destroyed. And Daniel replied, with a serenity that surprised even himself, that it hadn't been easy, that there were days when he didn't see any point in anything. But that one day, he woke up and realized that he no longer wanted to be defined by pain. That he couldn't teach his children to be strong if he himself held on to the tragedy. He said that forgiving her didn't mean going back. It just meant that he wouldn't carry her weight with him anymore. Laura cried. She apologized once more. She said that what she had done was not just a mistake, it was self-sabotage, emotional suicide. Daniel nodded. He said he hoped she would find herself again, that she would seek real help, that she would rebuild something for herself. But that he would no longer be there. That the Daniel she knew no longer existed. And that, as strange as it may seem, he was grateful for the fall. Because it was only after the fall that he learned to get up. At that moment, something came to a definitive end. Not with sadness, but with clarity. Laura walked away with tears in her eyes, without another word. And Daniel walked to the car where Sophia was waiting for him, with his children smiling in the back seat. He got in, closed the door, and as he drove, he looked in the rearview mirror one last time. The image of Laura huddled under the dim light of the street lamp was like a full stop. A necessary full stop. That night, when Marina was putting her to bed, she hugged her father tightly and said that she liked the new routine, that she liked Sophia's laughter, the way Daniel smiled now. Lucas, more restrained, simply said, "You feel lighter, Dad." And there, in that child's room, Daniel understood that he had won. Not because everything had worked out, but because even after everything had gone wrong, he chose to keep going. And that, more than anything else, was his greatest victory. Daniel's life, after that last encounter with Laura in the school parking lot, took an even firmer course, as if the steps that had previously been taken cautiously now found solid ground to advance on. There was no easy relief, no euphoria of victory, only the serene certainty that his cycle with her had definitively ended. The days began to have a clearer routine, a calm cadence. The mornings began with coffee, the afternoons were filled with projects at the office and small tasks with the children, and the nights, previously so long and empty, began to be shared, more and more frequently, with someone who understood his silences and respected his limits. Sophia did not occupy a substitute place. She was building something new by his side, something unhurried, with roots watered by respect, listening and a sensitivity that did not require constant explanations. Still, even with calm gradually returning, there were times when Daniel found himself thinking about everything that had happened, like someone revisiting a scar. It didn't hurt like it used to, but the memory of the cut remained. Sometimes, while tidying the children's room or looking at the backpacks thrown on the couch at the end of the day, he remembered Laura's laugh, a phrase said years ago, a promise that, at some point, was lost. It wasn't nostalgia. It was recognition. Life had been real. The love he felt was true. And the fall, although painful, had been necessary for him to learn to separate what was a tie from what was a knot. During this time of rebuilding, he also learned to see his children through a new prism. Lucas, increasingly introspective and observant, began to seek out his father for longer conversations, the kind that began with seemingly simple questions, but revealed how much his perception of everything was changing. Marina, more relaxed, showed affection for Sophia in a way that didn't seem forced, but spontaneous, as if her heart knew how to recognize someone who did her good. What Daniel didn't know yet was that Laura, on the other side of that story, was immersed in a silent process of coping. After their last meeting, she sought real help. She intensified her treatment, changed therapists, and cut the ties that bound her to repetitive cycles, including with Daniel's sister, whom she never spoke to again. She tried to find within herself the origins of so many destructive behaviors, so many impulsive choices that had nothing to do with a lack of love, but with a lack of self-love that had existed since long before the marriage. Laura began to write, filling entire notebooks with memories, requests for forgiveness that would never be sent, painful reflections on how much she had sabotaged her own happiness. There were good days, days when she believed she could still be a better person, even if she was alone. And there were days when everything fell apart and she found herself curled up on the living room floor, hugging her own legs, trying to understand where she had started to lose herself. One day, after leaving a therapy session, she decided to visit a place she hadn't been to since the first years of her marriage, the bookstore where they had bought Lucas's first children's storybook. When she entered, she felt a punch in the stomach. The smell of paper, the background music, the soft silence of the shelves, everything took her back to a time when the world seemed whole. She picked up a random book and started to leaf through it, but the letters got jumbled up before her eyes. Right there, sitting between the aisles, she cried. Not because she wanted to go back in time, but because she understood that she had destroyed herself the moment she started to run away from what was essential. Deep down, she knew that Daniel had been her safe haven. And that the betrayal, although real, was not just a physical act, it was an expression of what she refused to face within herself. And now, looking in the mirror every day, she saw a woman rebuilding herself, but with a trail of irreparable losses. On the other side of this story, Sophia was also experiencing her own dilemmas. Although she was becoming increasingly involved with Daniel and creating bonds with Marina and Lucas, she had fears. She had already been through a divorce, and had known the pain of being betrayed and abandoned. And now, faced with a man who clearly still carried wounds, no matter how strong he was, she wondered to what extent she was ready to share not only the good times, but also the shadows that still haunted the house. She didn't talk about it directly, but Daniel noticed it in her gestures, in the silences between one dinner and the next, in her hesitations when she slept there for the second or third night in a row. One night, he invited her to sit on the porch, the place where he used to spend sleepless nights. He told her that he didn't want her to feel pressured, that he knew she came from similar pains, and that if at any moment she felt she couldn't go on, he would understand. Sophia, with tears in her eyes, replied that it wasn't about doubts about him, but fear of losing herself again. Daniel held her hand and said that they were on the same road together. And that if they had the courage to be true, even with the wounds, maybe they could build something better than any fantasy. That moment sealed something between them. A silent pact of mutual care. During this process, a dilemma began to grow within Daniel. The closeness between Sophia and the children was real and affectionate. But Laura began to demonstrate, during her weekly visits, an honest attempt to get closer to her children. Without forcing, without manipulating. She just tried to be present, even if from the outside. One day, Marina asked her father why her mother always seemed sad, even when she smiled. Daniel replied that some people took longer to find their way back. Lucas, more direct, asked if his mother would ever move back in with them. Daniel, with a lump in his throat, said no, but that it didn't mean she would stop being part of their lives. This answer ate at him for days. Not because he doubted his decision, but because he knew that his children would have to learn too soon that not all families remain intact. And that, sometimes, loving someone also meant accepting that they could not occupy the same space as before. In the midst of this, a new situation arose. Marina was to receive an award at school for an art project, and her parents were invited to the ceremony. For the first time, Daniel, Sophia, and Laura would be in the same room, side by side. He felt the weight of the occasion, but decided to go without fear. He knew that his children needed to see him strong, not for pride, but for stability. When he arrived at the auditorium, Laura was already there, sitting discreetly in the last rows. Sophia arrived later, with a restrained smile, greeting the teachers kindly. The children went up on stage with enthusiasm, and Marina, upon receiving the medal, looked directly at her parents and waved happily. At that moment, something broke and was rebuilt at the same time inside all of them. After the event, Laura approached them. She thanked them for coming and praised Sophia sincerely, even though her voice was choked up. She said she was happy to see the children doing well. Sophia sweetly replied that she was there to help, not to replace them. Daniel listened in silence. When they said goodbye, he realized that, for the first time, there was no weight between them. Only the lightness of someone who had already said everything. And now, each of them would go their separate ways. That night, alone in his room, Daniel reflected on everything he had experienced in the last few years. He realized that the betrayal had not been the end. It was the beginning of a brutal and necessary transformation. Laura, in her downfall, had opened up space for him to find himself again. And now, about to take a new step with Sophia, with his children stronger and his heart less wounded, he understood that true strength does not lie in avoiding pain. It lies in going through it with dignity. And he had gone through it. In the weeks that followed the ceremony at school, life seemed to find a rare balance. Marina now slept with the certificate next to her bed, as if that piece of paper were a silent reminder that, even after the storms, there was still pride and achievements. Lucas, increasingly focused on his studies and chess games with his father, had come to see Daniel not only as the adult in the house, but as an example of constancy. And Sophia, with her firm delicacy, became a recurring and secure presence, but without forcing spaces, without trying to fill gaps that did not belong to her. Everything moved subtly, like a silent orchestra where each character seemed to have found their own beat, even if the notes still held a bitter nostalgia for what was lost. Daniel, however, knew that the apparent stability was fragile. Like tempered glass, resistant, but sensitive to the right point of impact. There were questions that had not yet been asked, conversations that he preferred to avoid for fear of what they might trigger. One Sunday, while walking with Sophia through the neighborhood fair, amid spontaneous laughter and exchanged glances between fruit stands and the smell of pastries, she stopped in front of a craft stall, held a small wooden sculpture in the shape of a tree and said, almost in a whisper, that there was something about Daniel that enchanted and frightened her at the same time. She said that, no matter how much he was present, there was a part of him that always seemed to be kept in a distant place, as if there was a locked room inside him that no one else entered. Daniel, taken by surprise, remained silent for a few moments. Then he said that perhaps she was right. That it was not for lack of love, but out of respect for the process itself. And that opening certain doors before the right time could mean losing everything that had been built with so much care. Sophia nodded, without resentment. She just said she would be there, but that she hoped one day to be invited in. At home that same night, Daniel was preparing dinner while Marina sat on the floor drawing and Lucas organized his books for the week. It was a common scene, but for some reason it hit him hard. He felt a pang of longing, not for Laura herself, but for what they had as a family unit. The memory of dinners full of conversation, of their voices mingling as they told stories to their children, even though they sounded distant today, was still vivid. The sound of the doorbell interrupted his thoughts. It was Laura. She was different. She was wearing a simple dress, her hair tied back, and her eyes less distressed. She asked if she could talk to him for 5 minutes. Daniel hesitated, but allowed it. He asked his children to go to their rooms and the two of them sat on the porch, the same space where he and Sophia had so often shared silences and truths. Laura took a deep breath and said that she hadn't come back to reopen any wounds, but that she had come to a painful conclusion, that she needed to move away for good. Not as a punishment, but for dignity. She told him she had gotten a job offer in another city, an opportunity for a real fresh start. She said she knew she would maintain her bond with her children, but that she physically needed to leave. That their relationship, no matter how peaceful it was, would always bring back memories, burdens, and shadows that would prevent either of them from moving forward with complete freedom. Daniel listened to everything in silence. There was no anger, nor relief. Just the strange feeling that this was, in fact, a goodbye. Laura continued saying that what he had built with Sophia was beautiful, that the children were fine, and that she didn't want to be another point of conflict or discomfort. She said she wanted to be remembered fondly, even if it was from a distance. Daniel thanked her, with tears in his eyes, and before she left, he asked if she was sure about her decision. Laura responded with a small, sincere smile, saying that for the first time in a long time, yes. She was. Days later, when he told his children that their mother would be away for a while because of her new job, their reaction was more mature than he had imagined. Lucas simply asked if she was okay. Daniel said yes. Marina, after a brief silence, said that she missed her hugs, but that she understood. And she added, "You're doing a good job, Dad." That was like a prize. Not a trophy displayed on a stage, but an invisible medal of silent recognition. The relationship with Sophia took on a new tone. Without the constant shadow of the recent past, Daniel began to allow himself more. He didn't talk about future plans out loud, but his gestures began to indicate that she was increasingly involved in everyday life. One weekend, they traveled together with the children to a simple cabin in the mountains. Wood-burning stove, light trails, evenings around the fireplace with stories and board games. Lucas opened up like never before. Marina slept hugging Sophia. Daniel observed everything as if watching a discreet miracle, without special effects, but full of meaning. When they returned from their trip, they decided to make their relationship official. Not with a party or announcements on social media. They simply sat down with their children and talked. They said they would be together, that she would be around more, and that she might even live with them soon. The children reacted naturally. Lucas, with his rationality, asked a few questions about logistics. Marina just wanted to know if there would still be room for her toys at Sophia's house. Their world, which had already been shaken, now found a way to reorganize itself with less fear. Laura, even though she was far away, kept in touch with her children through video calls. Daniel was clear about setting schedules and limits, but he never prevented them from connecting. He knew that, despite everything, the mother-child bond was sacred and needed to be preserved. During one of these calls, Laura asked to speak to Daniel. He accepted. She thanked him. He said she missed them, but that she was rebuilding a life with purpose. She was working with women in vulnerable situations. She said that her pain now served as a bridge to alleviate the pain of others. She had discovered a strength she never imagined she had. Daniel wished her luck and said he was happy for her. And he said goodbye calmly. Time passed. And one ordinary morning, walking with Sophia to the children's school, Daniel suddenly stopped in front of a flower stand. He bought a small bouquet of sunflowers and gave it to her. He said it wasn't for any specific date. It was just for everything. Sophia smiled. And in that smile, Daniel saw everything he thought he had lost one day: lightness, complicity, truth. Their story was not a fairy tale. It was made of ruins rebuilt, of forgiveness without return, of love relearned. A crooked path, but one walked with courage. And now, with the past finally in its place, Daniel felt he was ready to take the next step. Not just with Sophia, but with himself. Because the true beginning was not what you did with someone else, but what you chose to be after having known the deepest pain. And that choice, he had already made. Time followed its course with the relentless naturalness of days that impose themselves, regardless of our pain or joy. The seasons changed, the cycles began again, but the marks of the events lived remained, silent, like invisible tattoos that only hurt when touched. The house where Daniel lived now exuded a new energy. The hallways that were once filled with the uncertain footsteps of a man trying to survive the collapse became passages of a peaceful life. The routine, built brick by brick with effort, love and persistence, had become consolidated. There were no more ghosts in the rooms, no awkward silence between one laugh and the next. Sophia now lived with them. Sundays smelled of cake fresh from the oven and light conversations in the garden. Marina read to her brother at night, and Lucas, increasingly confident, had developed the habit of writing short chronicles inspired by the history of his own family, as if he wanted to immortalize what had shaped them and, at the same time, transformed them. Daniel began teaching at a local university. He said he didn't just want to build concrete structures, but to help build people. His students saw him as someone who carried a deep history in his eyes, although he never mentioned the past. Sophia opened a small flower shop, an old dream that she had always put off. Now, without fear, she decided to plant more than just flowers. She planted meanings, small gestures of affection and hope for those who crossed her door. And it was in that place that Daniel, from time to time, would stop by to pick up a new bouquet, not for special dates, but because he had learned that love is nourished by presence and simplicity. Laura, for her part, had courageously fulfilled her decision. She settled in a smaller town, close to a support center for women starting over. She took on an administrative position, but soon stood out for her sensitive listening and understanding. It was as if her own pain had become a compass. She helped other women not with ready-made formulas, but with the eyes of someone who knew what it was like to fall into the abyss and choose to get up without guarantees. She maintained regular contact with her children, who visited her on long weekends. Her conversations with Daniel were limited to the essentials, but they were respectful, firm and without a trace of resentment. He had understood that some pains do not require repair, but distance. And Laura, finally, accepted this space with maturity. On a symbolic night, everyone came together again. Lucas's graduation brought together family, friends, teachers and memories. Laura arrived discreetly, sitting in the last rows, dressed in white as if she carried peace in her body. Daniel and Sophia, with Marina between them, watched the ceremony with teary eyes. When Lucas went up on stage and gave his speech, everyone held their breath. He said that no one chooses the tragedies they experience, but they can choose what to do with them. He said that forgiving is not forgetting, but stopping the bleeding. And that, in that audience, there were all the versions of his story, the pain, the new beginning, and love in its most imperfect and, therefore, truest forms. Applause echoed throughout the hall, but it was the intertwined eyes of Daniel, Sophia and Laura that carried the weight of that moment. There, without words, each one recognized what the other had endured. Months later, Daniel and Sophia got married in a small ceremony in their backyard. Just their children, a few close friends, delicate flowers, and promises made in a firm voice. It wasn't a wedding to erase the past, but to honor what had been learned from it. At the end of the ceremony, Daniel made a toast. He said that everyone there carried scars, but that they were the ones that proved that they had survived. He said that loving again, after a fall, is the greatest act of courage. And that Sophia, with her silent love and constant presence, had been the ground where he had relearned to trust. Laura watched everything via video call, invited with respect and affection. He cried, not out of sadness, but out of recognition. Because now he understood that the love he had lost was no longer hers. It belonged to another time. And perhaps it had never been complete love, it was just a reflection of what she thought she deserved. For the first time, when he hung up the phone, he smiled peacefully. He crossed the street and sat on the bench in the square in front of the shelter. He helped a woman calm her small child who was crying in her arms. He said that life sometimes teaches with punches, but it also offers hugs. And that, no matter how much it hurts, it is worth moving on. And so, each of the characters followed their own path. None of them emerged unscathed. They all lost something, they all bled, they all faced long nights of doubt and regret. But all of them, in their own way, chose to walk. And, in the end, that was the difference between ruin and rebirth. Betrayal had been the trigger. But what defined the story was what came after, the choices, the truths spoken in pain, the forgiveness without reconciliation, and the patient reconstruction of what seemed irreparably destroyed. And now that you've heard this whole story, with its abysses, falls, and reconstructions, we want to know, what did you think of this journey? Which part impacted you the most? Leave your comment below, your opinion is very important to us. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, take advantage now. There are many stories like this, made to move, reflect, and show the raw reality of the choices we make. This story was more than just about betrayal. It was about what betrayal causes, the collapse of trust, the rupture of bonds that seemed eternal, the suffering of children, the weight of guilt and the difficult path of forgiveness. Betrayal destroys what is most sacred between two people, the shared truth. It undermines love, hurts dignity and, often, drags innocent people into pain. May this story serve as a warning, a mirror, a reflection. Because love, to last, requires honesty, and the slightest deviation can cause irreversible consequences. And we reiterate once again, this channel does not support any type of betrayal. Here, we tell stories like this to show the brutal reality behind what many still treat lightly. Betrayal is not entertainment. It is a wound. And only those who have experienced it know how hard it is to survive. Thanks for making it this far. See you in the next story.